We'll begin with an opening statement from the Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and honourable members. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the government's decision to replace the mandatory census long form with a voluntary form. Our government's reason for replacing the mandatory census with a voluntary national survey on the long form is clear. We do not believe that it is appropriate to compel Canadians to divulge extensive private and personal information. We do not believe that Canadians should be forced, under threat of fines, jail, or both, to divulge the answers to questions such as, how many sick days did you take last year? Were you paid for those? What were your total payments for your primary dwelling last year? Do you have any broken floor tiles in need of repair in your bathroom? We recognize that the information gathered in the long-form census is valuable. However, we also recognize that a balance must be drawn when the government is collecting data under the threat of fines or jail or both. Now, although the census goes back to 1871, the long-form census has only been around since 1971, and the level of detailed personal information Canadians are being asked to hand over to the government has grown. The basic 8 census questions have remained constant for decades. The additional questions that suddenly appeared in 1971 have been modified, with new ones added each census. La version courte de recensement est...
The short-form census questionnaire is mandatory and has 8 mandatory questions on basic demographic information such as birth date, gender, civil status, and mother tongue. It is sent to all Canadian households.
Minister responsible for Statistics Canada, I have heard directly from individuals and groups a very compelling message that the government should not threaten people with prosecution when collecting detailed private and personal data. That is why our government announced that we would no longer punish Canadians for choosing not to complete the 40-page long-form survey sent to 20% of households. Now, critics of this decision believe that if a Canadian refuses to fill out the long form, that person deserves to be prosecuted to a maximum fine of $500 or to imprisonment of 3 months or both. The government asked Statistics Canada to provide options for administering a voluntary long-form questionnaire. And I want to be clear on this point. It was our government that took the decision to put an end to the concept of threatening Canadians with fines and or jail time for not completing the 40-page census long form. We then sought options from Statistics Canada on how to implement a reliable voluntary survey, and this led to the creation and implementation of the National Household Survey. This reasoned and responsible approach is about finding a better balance between collecting necessary data and protecting the privacy rights of Canadians. That long-form data will now be collected through this new voluntary survey, the National Household Survey. The questions that will be asked in the new survey are identical to the questions that would have been asked in the mandatory long-form census. Moreover, on the advice of StatsCan, who recognized that the sample size would decrease as the long form becomes voluntary, we have agreed to send the National Household Survey to 4.5 million Canadian households, almost double the sample size from 2006. This will be the largest survey distributed to the Canadian population in our history. The short-form census of population remains mandatory, and we count on every Canadian to provide this basic information as they did in previous censuses. StatsCan will administer the National Household Survey in close coordination with the census and will use a variety of non-coercive methods to encourage Canadians to respond to the survey. We will also take steps to strengthen the communications and advertising efforts around the National Household Survey in order to address concerns about response rates. Now, this is the first time StatsCan is conducting the National Household Survey. StatsCan will be monitoring the results carefully, applying the same rigorous methods and standards used for all of its voluntary surveys. This will achieve the appropriate balance between the need to collect information on households to inform public policy without undue legal requirements on Canadians to do so. Un certain nombre de préoccupations ont été soulevées après l'annonce.
A certain number of concerns were raised following the announcement, and allow me to provide some clarification thereon.
Comply with its obligations under the Official Languages Act. Mais je vous assure que toutes les questions en rapport avec...
But I assure you that all questions with regard to the official languages polled in the 2006 census will be kept in the short-form census questionnaire for 2011.
Questions on Canadians' knowledge of official languages, mother tongue, and languages spoken at home. And this government remains fully committed to take into account the priorities of the Office of the Commissioner of Languages in the development and implementation of its policies, programs, and services. Les spécialistes en généalogie nous ont aussi...
Genealogy experts have also told us that they were concerned that they would no longer be able to consult personal information contained in the long-form census questionnaire after 2012 without the consent of the respondents. To allay these concerns, I specifically requested that Statistics Canada include in the National Household Survey a question to ensure that the respondent provided their consent to make sure that all this information could be communicated after 92 years.
Balance between asking mandatory, personal and intrusive questions and making those questions voluntary. However, we've not heard anything from the opposition or critics regarding their views on which questions should be mandatory versus voluntary. Now, the opposition parties have promised to force all Canadians to answer personal and intrusive questions about their private lives under threat of jail, fine, or both. With the opposition failing to support our government's tough-on-crime agenda, I find it curious that the only people the opposition are willing to get tough on are those law-abiding Canadians who do not want to divulge extensive personal and private information to representatives of the state. We believe, however, that our new approach, combining a mandatory short-form census with a voluntary long-form survey, achieves an appropriate balance between the need for data to inform public policy research while respecting the privacy of Canadians. I want to comment for a moment on the role of the Cabinet and the suggestion by some that politicians should play no role in these decisions. Under Section 31 of the Statistics Act, answering census questions is mandatory, and Canadians who refuse are subject to fine or imprisonment. I understand that there are some who believe the people's elected representatives should have no say in this decision, but that is not what the legislation provides. The legislation requires democratic accountability before the penal power of the state is engaged. Specifically, Section 21, Sub 1 of the legislation says that Cabinet must approve the questions that Canadians are forced to answer. Mr. Chairman, this just plain makes sense. If a Canadian is subject to imprisonment for not answering, he or she should be assured that the mandatory questions were approved by the democratically elected government. Further, citizens deserve to have the right of appeal to their democratically elected representatives rather than be told that they have no rights because democratic accountability has no place in the census. As I said, starting with the Trudeau government in the 1970s, Liberal cabinets have dramatically expanded the list of mandatory questions. Now, one can agree or disagree with those decisions, but they were properly made by elected governments discharging their accountability under the legislation. Our government has exercised our statutory responsibility differently by reducing the number of mandatory questions and increasing the number of voluntary ones. Again, this is what the legislation provides. So to those in the opposition or to commentators who have criticized not just the decision but the very authority for the decision, I ask this simple question. Who do you want to decide under what circumstances you are subject to jail? Your duly elected representatives or someone else who is unaccountable to you? I believe that our government's decision finds that balance between collecting necessary data and protecting the privacy rights of Canadians, and I look forward to hearing the views from today's committee meeting. This coming spring, I encourage all Canadians to fill out the National Household Survey should they choose to do so. StatsCan will continue to conduct and oversee the census process, and its employees will maintain the same rigorous methods and standards used for all of its surveys. Thank you, Chair. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.